Hello, beautiful people.
And welcome to the second installment in the rotation guide series. Today we're going to be looking at Kazuha rotations. Before we get into the rotation themselves, we'll have to address a few things about Kazuha's kit. The first thing about Kazuha is normal attack doesn't really do anything special, except this one, plunging attack, Midare Ranzan. When a plunging attack is performed using the effect of elemental skill, so basically when you use his E, you can then do a plunge attack. Plunging attack damage is converted to animal damage and will create a small wind tunnel via a secret blade technique that pulls nearby objects and opponents. The part that matters for his plunge attack is, so if his E comes into contact with Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro when cast, it will absorb that element. And once that element is absorbed, it will make it so that the plunge attack that you do will deal damage of that element as well. Right? His E, this deals animal damage around him and groups enemies together. You can hold it to have the AoE be bigger and it deal more damage. But also, when you hold it, the gauge of animal that is applied to an enemy is different. When I use an element, apply 1 unit of that element, and then use Kazuha hold E, it removes it, and then when I plunge it can reapply it. But it removes it when I do the hold E. It removes it. But when I do tap E instead of hold E, it will not actually remove it. Right? It's not actually removed, and now it expires. His hold E and his tap E apply a different amount of animal, which means that depending on what setup you're going for, sometimes you'll want to use tap E, sometimes you'll want to use hold E, and it will be the difference between getting the swirl you want and not getting the swirl you want. So it is relevant. We'll talk about which ones to use in which situations later, but for now, let's keep going through his kit. Then his burst, he does a slash around him that deals animal damage. Then for the next 8 seconds, every 1.6 seconds, so 5 times over 8 seconds, he'll have an additional instance of animal damage. And if at any time there is an element present within that field, it will infuse with that element and start additionally doing elemental absorption. It can only do 1 element though. When it comes to which element gets absorbed, because obviously it's possible that you have one enemy applied with an element and another enemy applied with a different element, there is an elemental priority between different elements. The element is Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, or FEC. PHEC. So if you have one enemy applied with Pyro, or one enemy applied with Electro, because Pyro has the highest priority, we get a Pyro infusion. But another thing that can happen is your character can be applied with an element, right? If I walk up, I let them attack me, right? I have Cryo on my character, and now if I do my E, I get a Cryo infusion, right? Because it's the only element we have. Now, that can be used to get specific elements, even if the enemies aren't affected with them. So, for example, if I do Yelan's EQ, Bennett Q, right? None of them are affected with Pyro. They're all either Hydro or nothing. But then I do his hold E, or his tap E. I still get a Pyro infusion on my plunge attack because I'm standing in Bennett's burst. And Bennett's burst applies Pyro to your character. So it's not just elements that are on the enemies, it's also elements on your character, and it always follows the elemental priority. Now, I've talked about this in my other Kazuha video, but absorption is not a swirl. Usually when you get a Pyro swirl with Kazuha, because of his passive, right? His other passive, which we haven't talked about yet, you get elemental damage bonus of the element you swirled. Also, because of Viridescent Venerer, you get the Viridescent Venerer shred. If you look at my Bennett, or at my Kazuha stats, after swirling Pyro, I get Pyro damage. Now I'm gonna do a setup that's gonna get me a Pyro infusion, but when I pause and when we look at the stats, I'm not gonna have Pyro damage. So I get a Pyro swirl, not a Pyro swirl, I get a Pyro infusion. My plunge attack did Pyro damage, but if I look at my stats, I'm in fucking Bennett burst. Okay, I have the Hydro damage, but I don't have the Pyro damage. We didn't actually get a Pyro swirl there, even if we got an infusion. In order to get a Pyro swirl, you need to have the enemy be affected by the element and then deal animal damage, which we didn't actually do here, even though we got an infusion. Now, because of that, that's actually going to affect a lot of the setups we do. So it is important to know that. His energy generation, he generates 3 energy on his tap E and 4 on his hold E. Let's get into specific rotations because a lot of this is like, you have the knowledge now, but you need to know how to use it, right? The first team we're gonna use, I guess International is actually. If you're relatively new to this team and you don't want to bother with doing the perfect setups, what you'll do is you'll just swirl Pyro, use Xiangling's burst, go to Child. Right, very straightforward setup, but we don't get a Hydro Swirl, which means we don't get the VV on Hydro, and we don't get the damage bonus from his Ascension passive. But there are setups that allow for you to get both elements swirled. That's why so many people say that Kazuha's not that good if you're not getting double swirl. I agree with that. If you're not actually getting a swirl on both of your elements, and Kazuha's just not actually that good. He's still comfortable, he's still a nice grouper, but he's not amazing if you don't get your double swirls. So, most of this video will be focused on teams where double swirls are relevant and how to get them. So, for International, Child's elemental skill cast at the beginning, as soon as you use it, it applies 2 units of Hydro. Bennett's Burst applies 2 units of Pyro, but when you do a Vaporize with Pyro on Hydro, the amount of gauge that you remove from the Hydro is half-ish of the amount of gauge that you apply. So effectively, if I do 2 Hydro followed by 2 Pyro, I still have some Hydro left, and then it disappears. And because Kazuha's E will get a Pyro infusion if you do it inside of Bennett's Burst, then you can use his initial E to swirl the Hydro. It's going to remove the element, and then you have an infusion of Pyro, so when you do your plunge attack, you're swirling Pyro. So, if we do Child's E, followed by Bennett Burst, followed by Kazuha hold E, and then we go take a look at Bennett's stats, we have the Pyro damage, and we have the Hydro damage. We got to swirl on both Pyro and Hydro, we have a good setup. After we're done with our setup, we cast Xiangling's Burst, E, cast Child's Burst, E, right, and you get, you get proper International. Now, there can be a problem. So, right, when you're in AoE, here's what your setup does. As you can see, they still have Hydro on them. If I go take a look at my stats, I didn't actually get a Pyro Swirl. Because Kazuha's E swirls Hydro, but the way that swirl works is if you swirl an enemy that has Hydro, it's going to apply Hydro to the enemies around them. So if there's 2 enemies, then swirl isn't going to remove the Hydro, it's going to reapply the Hydro. And what you want in order to get a Pyro Swirl is for your swirl to remove the Hydro. So, what's the solution? The way is to make sure that your Child E only hits one of the enemies. If I only hit one of the 2 and then I do this, one has Hydro, one has Pyro, and literally just from the E itself, I get both of my swirls. But you need to know that you have to sometimes adapt your rotations when it comes to AoE versus single target. Let's go through a rotation. You do the setup, you do this, you do this. We're gonna opt not to use our burst for now on Kazuha. Okay, do this, this. Oh wow, shit, our rotation is over. We don't have Child's E. That's normal. Generally, you want to stay on Child for about 9 seconds. So, what that means is, for a second rotation, our E is still going to be on cooldown when we would want to use it for the setup. Which means for the second rotation, we won't actually be able to do the same setup. Or, we'll have to wait a bit longer in order to do it, right? You can't always just wait a bit longer and do the setup again. But, another thing you can do is do a slightly different setup. You would do Bennett Burst, Child Charge Shot, and then Kazuha hold E. And that is the way that we get our double swirl. This is not a rotation that you can actually do on your first rotation, because if you do it like this, he doesn't have Hydro. The reason why he ends up with Hydro on him is because he already has the Riptide mark from your first rotation. And when an enemy has the Riptide mark, Child's Charge Shots will cause a Riptide Flash, which applies 1 additional instance of Hydro. So, right, if you start with no element, but with a Riptide mark, start with Bennett Burst, he has Pyro, but Child's Charge Shot will remove Hydro, and the Riptide Flash will reapply Hydro, which you can then use to do your double swirl. If you do it this way, you can get 24-second rotations. If you do it by just waiting for your E to be back, you'll get about 30-second rotations instead. Your rotations will be slower, but you'll also have more Bennett uptime on your Child. Both are viable. I generally prefer the shorter rotation with a charge shot. That was a lot of talk about Child, but let's talk about one of the things that makes Kazuha very, very good in this team. So I'm gonna go and do one of the setups. I'm gonna start by not doing exactly a correct setup, but I will just want to show an interaction. And that interaction is gonna be a pyro-infused Kazuha burst on an enemy that has Hydra on them. Now obviously we did not get our pyro swirl, but what I want you to look at is the aura on the enemy. Even though our Kazuha burst is very clearly infused with pyro, we're not actually applying pyro to these enemies. Or rather, we are applying pyro, but there's still some hydro left, and then our swirl is spreading that hydro and basically refreshing it. Now, this is the reason why using Kazuha's burst in international does not actually make you lose waves, or when it does, it's very few. It's because as long as you're in AoE, Kazuha's burst, even when pyro infused, can actually help with hydro application. That's the thing that Kazuha is helping you do. And on top of that, I mean, it's Kazuha's burst, so it's doing a pretty relevant, maybe not massive, but definitely a relevant amount of damage. Because of the way that the interaction works, after your plunge attack, they all have pyro, so you can immediately get a vape. If you can one rotation the enemies like this, you might want to use Child's burst before Xiangling's burst, just so that your Xiangling burst lasts longer on the second wave. Right, so here we get a really quick 2 waves because we managed to use our Xiangling burst after our child burst instead of before, even though usually you want to use it before, right? You use his burst in AoE, you don't have to use it in single target, but you can. All right, we do the same base setup. Attack on Child until his burst says about 6 seconds, and swap out to Bennett. Go to Xiangling, drop Guoba, Kazuha. Bennett, go to Xiangling, and then Bennett burst, the charge shot, and then Kazuha. And you start over, right? We got a double swirl. We got our damage on both Pyro and Hydro. We're ready for a second rotation. The reason I use Kazuha's burst instead of his E there is just because I was gonna fucking die. In this team, you swap to Kazuha effectively about once every 12 seconds. It lines up very well with Favonius cooldowns, so if you have a Favonius, fucking use it. Next up, let's take a look at a setup with Yelan, I guess. Right, so I talked about Yelan setups in my Yelan rotation video, but we can still go through it very quickly. Because Yelan's burst applies 2 units of Hydro, you kind of have to be careful about the way that you go about it. What I like doing is Bennett burst E or E burst, followed by Yelan burst auto E, auto, then Kazuha hold E. Now the reason why the hold E is actually important on this one, a lot more than usual, is because this time we're getting a 1 unit Hydro application from Yelan's burst, like the exquisite throws, but we're getting it right before Kazuha's E. So if we wait, if we do this, right? If we do this instead, right, we got our Pyro Infusion, but our initial E, or tap E, because it only applies 1 unit of Animo, did not remove the Pyro, and we didn't actually get our Pyro damage bonus, or our VV on Pyro. So it is important here in this team to do a hold E on Kazuha instead of a tap E. Now this is a team that is actually very difficult, where it's very difficult to get a double swirl in AoE. You have to make sure that some of the enemies are affected with Pyro and some are affected with Hydro. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that, like, one of them has Hydro on them, and then another one has Pyro, and then you use your hold E or tap E. But, like, honestly, fuck that. This is one of the teams where it is actually so difficult to get it consistently in AoE that I just wouldn't recommend going for it. Just don't bother. With Xingqiu, you can kind of cheat-ish, but not really. It's like, ugh. Right, like here we got it. But basically what you have to do is you have to, like, cancel an auto. And it's a pain in the ass. Honestly, if you're gonna be playing a national version, don't use Kazuha. Stick to Sucrose. Sucrose is better with Woba Swirl. In a lot of teams, Kazuha is easier to play than Sucrose. In this team, Kazuha's harder to play than Sucrose. And not better. Just stick to Sucrose. We can go back to the Geoba shop and show it with Xingqiu and single target. Now with Xingqiu, you have your orbitals around your character that will reapply Hydro if you're too close to enemies. And if you reapply Hydro, you don't get a Pyro Swirl. So, Xingqiu Burst, auto attack. Bennett Burst, auto attack. Kazuha Burst, auto. I think I got it barely there. Yeah, I got it, but barely there. It's really hard to do if you're close to the enemy. So generally, take a step back to use your E on Kazuha. Now finally is Ayato. That's the last Hydro that's generally used in this team. This one's fucking RNG. You'll be able or unable to do your setup depending on the way that his burst hits the enemy. It's actually just literally RNG. But yeah. Ayato Burst, Bennett Burst, wait. Hold E, hope it doesn't fall. Ah, we got fucked. Right, so here, I believe we got fucked. Yeah, we didn't get the Pyro because the burst hit a second time, or applied Hydro a second time before we got our plunge attack. But yeah, which is also why with this team, I recommend Sucrose over Kazuha as well. Our setups in national teams are always involving the Hydro unit, the Bennett, and the Kazuha. We never need to swap the Xiangling in any of the setups, which means you can do the same setups with any Pyro carry. The setups will be different if you're using different units. Very often, for Hu Tao specifically, you do not want to run her with Bennett, so we'll take a look at setups that involve other Pyro units. The Amber setup relies on first getting your Xingqiu buff active, then using Amber's burst. What that's gonna do is you're gonna get your instructor set, and once the burst has hit enough times, you will apply Pyro. After that, you go to Kazuha and you use his E to swirl Pyro, and then you do an auto attack with Xingqiu's burst active, and you walk up to the enemy. That way you're gonna apply 2 sources of Hydro, it's gonna remove the Pyro, reapply Hydro, and then you use Kazuha's burst. So, Xingqiu Q, E, E, Amber burst, wait, and like this. And just like that, we got our Pyro damage bonus and our Hydro damage bonus. Now, the reason why it's higher than before is because Amber's on Instructor, which buffs Kazuha's Elemental Mastery, which in turn buffs the damage percent buff that Kazuha gives to your team. Now, the reason why you want to do this setup is because you end up with a double swirl and with a Hydro-infused burst, which is going to help your Hu Tao vaporize more easily. That's very good. That's exactly what you want. Now, in AoE, it will be very difficult for you to remove the Pyro Aura completely before you use Kazuha's burst. And if the Pyro Aura is not completely removed, then you will get a Pyro Infusion. And if you get a Pyro Infusion, you lose Vapes. Getting a Pyro Infusion on your Kazuha burst in a Hu Tao team is a massive DPS loss, and it's something you want to avoid, like, 100%. So what you can do is you can just do the same thing as you usually do on your other teams, but it's easier with Amber than it is with Bennett. So, apply Hydro to one and Pyro to the other. Right? Fuck you. Fuck you. Because Amber's burst is like not that large, it's relatively easy to end up in a situation where some of the enemies have Hydro and some of the enemies have Pyro. Next up, Thoma. Now the reason why this rotation is hard is because Thoma's burst launches a wave, right? The wave travels faster than Xingqiu's sword. You need to use your Kazuha E after the wave hits, but before the Xingqiu swords hit. That way you can swirl Pyro. There we go! Yeah! If you have C6 Xingqiu, it's a lot easier because what you can do is you can do 2 auto attacks with Xingqiu's burst active before you swap to Kazuha. And because the C6, like the 5 sword wave, takes a little bit longer to come out, then you have a slightly bigger window to do the E. But yeah, once you've got that, you can swap to Hu Tao and do Hu Tao stuff. I don't want to kill him though. Who's next? What, Xinyan maybe? Alright, that's fucking cringe though. Alright, this one we got it, but man. So you can use QE on Xinyan instead of EQ to make sure that your E doesn't do the damage over time, right? In order to get the shield level 3, you still need to hit 2 opponents, and you don't get the damage over time without shield level 3. And you don't want the damage over time because it can fuck with your Hu Tao vapes. One thing to note though is that when you have Xinyan's shield, every time I swap to a different character, it applies Pyro. So you have to make sure that you have Hydro on the enemy before you swap to a different character. Next up, Yanfei. So you should be able to do Xingqiu EQE, or EQ if you don't have suck. Yanfei burst E, Kazuha E, auto Q. That being said though, you need a lot of ER on Yanfei in this scene. You can actually use Xiangling. It's complicated. So you can do a pseudo Guoba swirl kinda-ish that only works in single target. Yeah, Guoba absorb basically. I didn't get it, did I? Oh no, I did get it. Okay, so we got it here. You can also use your Kazuha burst if you auto beforehand to make sure that it's infused with Hydro. Actually, no, you probably can't in this, because Gola is going to make it infused with Pyro. We get a Pyro infusion, even if there's no enemy, and even if our character is not affected with Pyro, because Guoba counts as a fucking entity that Kazuha's burst looks at. It's a pain in the ass. Anyways, generally, complicated double vape setups are basically only in VV Vape and Melt, but the only real Melt team that actually wants to run Kazuha is Melt Ganyu, and I don't have Ganyu. I'll have to use someone else's rotation, which, by the way, if you like theory crafting content, Jay's turn streams at hours that are very different from mine. So if you can't catch my streams, you might be able to catch his, and you should check him out. So you start with Zhongli's E, then you do Ganyu's E charge attack. Now the charge attack is actually important. The charge attack lets you get the right timing, right? Because as we're gonna see, right, you do this. Then you use Kazuha's E, you get a Cryo Swirl. The main purpose of this Kazuha E is energy generation. But then we use Bennett Burst, that removes the Cryo. Then we use Kazuha's Burst, and look at this. Cryo application. Now where did that come from? Well, it came from Ganyu's Bloom exploding at the right timing in the middle of her Kazuha Burst animation, right? That's why you do a Ganyu Charge Shot and a Kazuha E at that moment in the rotation, is because it helps you line up your Ganyu Bloom explosion between your Bennett Burst and your Kazuha Burst. Now that's gonna get you a Cryo Swirl at the perfect moment, right? It's gonna get you a Cryo Swirl right before you swap to Ganyu, and because you're standing in Bennett Burst, it's gonna be a Pyro infused Kazuha Burst, and it's gonna apply Pyro. And because it applies Pyro, you can use the Kazuha Burst to melt Ganyu's charge attacks and get your rotations that way. You should be able to get 4, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4. Technically, you could get a 5th one if it's like the end of your rotation, but it is going to extend it, and it's generally not worth it when it comes to like strictly DPS. So unless you're finishing off an enemy, generally stick to 4. Then you go Bennett E, Kazuha E, Zhongli E, start over. It's a dank rotation. Melt Ganyu, especially the Kazuha version, is incredibly difficult to play, but that's how you do it. Are there any other reverse melt teams I want to look at? Not really, because the other reverse melt teams generally do better with double Pyro. I mean, I guess I can show something like this, but I personally would not recommend this team. I would recommend going for Xiangling over Kazuha basically every time. But if you really want to do it, start with Bennett E Burst, Kaeya E, Rosaria E, Kazuha Burst E, Rosaria Burst, Kaeya Burst. Now this team is kind of shit if you don't have C6 Bennett, because you just don't apply enough Pyro. But yeah, that's kind of just how you play it, and then that's it. Now we're gonna move on to the teams where the setups are a little bit more, or a little bit easier. Let's start with the Taser team, why not? So you start with this, right, same as usual. Oh my god. Then you do one Beidou E, then you do this. And that should get you swirls on both elements. But effectively, if you really want to get swirls on both elements, a lot of the time it's going to be better to just get your swirl after you use Fischl E, which means that you're not actually going to get the damage percent bonus on Fischl for her first E. You'll get it on her second E onwards, but unfortunately not on the first one. The thing with Taser teams is their rotations are like somewhat flexible, especially the Xingqiu variations, because Xingqiu's burst doesn't snapshot, so you can kind of just use it whenever the fuck you want. The main ones where the setups are a little bit more important will be the rotations where you're using something like Kokomi. So you start with using Kokomi's E, then Beidou's E, then Kazuha E, Q, then Beidou Q, Fischl Q, Kazuha E, Kokomi Burst, etc. attack on her until the enemies are until the burst runs out-ish. And yeah, relatively straightforward. The main idea is you want to use your Hydro, then Beidou's E, which will apply enough Electro for you to get an Electro Swirl. But you don't want to use Beidou's burst immediately because you want to get Kazuha's damage bonus on your Beidou before you use her burst, because her burst snapshots. We can do Ayato. Now, getting a double swirl is reliant on the exact gauge on each enemy. It's easier to get a double swirl when you use your hold E on Kazuha than when you use your tap E, because it applies more animo. So generally, you'll try to use your hold E if you can. So, you start with Kazuha's burst again, right? Hydro, then Beidou E, then Kazuha hold E, Q, Beidou Q, Fischl Q, Ayato. Now when it runs out, Kazuha hold E again, Beidou E, Fischl E, start over. Raiden, let's start with Raiden Taser. You start with her E, right? Very, very straightforward. Now, once your burst expires, Kazuha's E, Fischl's E, and you can start over. Now, one thing that you should really pay attention to in this team is always use Fischl's burst, even when you feel that it's not really doing anything. Because if you don't use it, then you don't get the resolve on Raiden, and if you don't get the resolve on Raiden, her burst does a lot less damage. If you're playing double Hydro Taser with Raiden, it's not that big of a portion of your total rotational damage that happens here. So just cast all of your Hydro abilities, then Kazuha EQ, then Raiden burst. The core for Raiden Hyper is Raiden, Bennett, Kazuha. The last unit is basically any Electro unit. Some people even use Mona sometimes. I'm not a huge fan of Mona. My personal favorite is Fischl by far. You can use Sarah, you can use Yai, you can use Lisa. They effectively all work the same way. You start with Raiden's E, but you want to make sure your Raiden E hits the enemies. Then you Bennett burst, and as you can see, Raiden's E is going to trigger from Bennett's burst and is going to reapply Electro to the enemies. And because the enemies are now applied with Electro, you can use Kazuha's EQ, it will swirl Electro, then you can use your Electro support and then Raiden. So you start with Raiden E, Bennett burst, Kazuha, E, Q, Fischl Q, Raiden Q. Technically you'd want to use Fischl EQ instead of Fischl just Q, but whatever. That being said, this rotation can sometimes struggle against non-heavy enemies because you're going to trigger a lot of overloads with Kazuha. So a way you can adapt the rotation is just use your Bennett burst later. So you start with Raiden E again, then Kazuha EQ, then Bennett burst, and then the Fischl, then Raiden. And this way you don't get the overloads. Now, obviously, the overloads actually do represent a significant portion of the damage in your team, so if you're not getting them, you will be losing out on some DPS, but it will also make it a lot easier to deal with content where overload fucks you over like this. I guess we can do soup teams. In a team like this, the main idea is get your Raiden E going, get your Xingqiu burst and E going, get your Bennett burst going, and then use Kazuha to swirl all three elements, or at the very least, Hydro and Electro. Raiden E, Xingqiu E, Q, Auto E, Auto E, E on Kazuha, E on Bennett, burst on Raiden. 1, 2, 3 charge attack, 1, 2, 3 charge attack, 1, 2, 3 charge attack, 1 charge attack, E, Kazuha E, Bennett E, and start over. For freeze teams, as a general rule, as long as you don't give your TTDS to Kazuha, you'll be fine. Right, so you start with your cryo support. You use their skill, their burst, apply cryo. Kazuha skill burst. Hydro freeze, and then cryo carry, do your things. Then you can swap back to Kazuha. Back to your cryo support to generate particles, back to your cryo carry to catch them, and then start over. Just make sure you don't stay on the same unit for too long in Ayaka teams. Right, like, the thing is, I could go through literally every unit in the game and how you set them up with Kazuha. But, like, when your team, for example, is like, I don't have Klee, but like Yanfei, Bennett, Kazuha, Xiangling, a team like this, the setup isn't crazy. It's literally just you Bennett burst and then you Kazuha. Bennett burst, then Kazuha. Your setup is done. That's it. That's literally all there is to it. But effectively, as a general rule, apply an element with something that doesn't snapshot, right? So like, don't start with your Xiangling burst. Just apply your element, then swirl it, then you're done. Are there any other teams I haven't done that actually have dank setups? I guess TF Kazuha. Your TF rocks reduce your Kazuha cooldown when he's on field. So you stay on Kazuha and do like 3 E's instead of 1, then you swap out and you start over again. It's a 15-second rotation. So Kazuha burst, infuse it with Hydro, add Oz, swirl, Kazuha E, Q, E. I kind of fucked up the thing here. E. I killed him too fast here too! Wait, after that you just Venti burst again. But yeah, rotations are complicated, and there's always a lot of them. So if you disagree with one of my rotations, if you think I made a mistake, let me know in the comments. I'll have a pinned comment below if there's anything that I've messed up. And yeah, that does it for Kazuha. Make sure you tell me what unit you want to see next. And yeah, I'll see you guys around. See ya. Goodbye, YouTube.